All right, we are recording. You're good to go, Mariam.
Great. I'm gonna see if we can give it just a couple minutes before we get started, just to see if we can wait for Carrick to join. If that's all right.
Eric is in the elevator.
Excellent.
Perfect. And while we wait, I'll just announce as you saw, we are recording these meetings. I do have the recording from last week. I'm going to put that YouTube link into the chat box, and you'll be able to find all of our recordings from these sessions there, along with the ones from previous years. So as soon as I dig up that link again, I'll place it in the chat box.
All right. Well, since Carrick will be joining us any minute now, and have some questions to start with for, oh, Carrick just made it on. Hello, welcome.
Yep. Great.
Great. Then if you're good to go, let's get started.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for joining us. This is the second session of the Stupid Questions for Apple Production. Today we're going to be focusing on Southern Blight. We're going to have Carrie Peter at Penn State and Carrick Cox at Cornell talk us through how worried we need to be and what we need to be looking out for, and what even is Southern Blight. Do you think is where we are going to get started. So Carrie, could you give us kind of an overview of what this disease even is?
Sure. So Southern Blight of Apple, it's a soil-borne disease. So this is a disease that it exists in the soil, and the pathogen is, well, let's put it this way. It's Southern Blight is Southern Blight is Southern Blight. So you may heard of Southern Blight of tomato or soybean. It's the Sclerotium rollsii. It's a basidiomycete, meaning it will produce tiny sclerotia, and those sclerotia live in the soil, and they can live in the soil a really, really, really long time. And how I discovered it in Pennsylvania was in the summer of 2018, where we had twice the annual rainfall that summer, and it was super hot. And I was alerted by a grower to some trees that were dying. They didn't know why. Brand new trees that were planted that year. I believe it was Crimson Crisp on Bud 9. Had been in a location that had never been in apple before. It was actually surrounded by woods. I'm not even sure if it was planted in agronomic crops. When I went to go see them, I lifted up, they use Tyvek tree guards to protect their trees. When I lifted up the Tyvek tree guard, I saw this white fan-like mycelia right at the crown of the tree at the soil line. And I was like, this is a fungus. I said, this isn't a mystery disease. When we looked much closer, we could see the sclerotia on the soil. We could see, and the sclerotia was tan colored, varying degrees of tan to dark brown. The sclerotia was on the soil, on the mycelia that was touching, or that was kind of encasing the tree at the crown. When we dug up the tree, we saw the white mycelia through the soil, and that was basically the characteristic diagnostic symptoms. And then as the summer progressed, we saw more trees pop up in different locations, trees that were 5 years old or 11 years old, or, different rootstocks. But it was the same pattern where we saw the mycelia that was on the crown at the soil line, the sclerotia on the mycelia or on the debris that may have been surrounding the tree at the soil line. But the mycelia and sclerotia kind of went hand in hand. And what this fungus does is that it kills the roots. I mean, there's just no halfway, it kills the roots. And so as far as susceptibility, what the literature says and what the compendia says, that basically all rootstocks are susceptible, but you know, that research is old. When I kind of dove in a bit deeper, there's not a whole lot of research that's being done on southern blight because it seems sporadic. And consequently, as a result of the lack of research, there's no chemical preventative means other than like chemical fumigation. So there are fungicides that are approved for other crops like carrot southern blight or tomato southern blight. And so there are products, fungicides that are approved for those, but there are no fungicides that have the southern blight label for apple and can be used as a soil drench. So there's one product out there that has that's labeled for apple, and it also has a label for carrot southern blight. So of course, this is one way we hope to see how this works, you know, goes down the line as far as working. But right now, what's concerning in South Central Pennsylvania, where I'm located, where 75% of the apples are grown, is that, you know, we have this disease. It's not an isolated incident. It seems to be everywhere in the county. And it doesn't matter what rootstock so far, that the disease, it's something that most likely has been in the soil a long time. And 2018 may have been the trigger, the first domino. What I am noticing is that even though the disease in the literature, it says this disease really likes warm temperatures, we're talking in the 80s, especially soil temperatures in the 80s, and it likes moisture. So you need warm temperatures and moistures for that sclerotia to germinate. And what I'm noticing is that it doesn't take much soil moisture and much temperature at the ideal temperature and soil moisture for the sclerotia to germinate, because we've had some dry years, and we've also had some years or the last couple of years where we haven't had a repeat of 2018 where we've had 80 inches of rain. Some years have been a lot less rain, but we're still seeing the disease pop up. So it seemed that initial domino kind of, it was enough to get things started. And what we're seeing is that it's not going away, and because it's not going away, I'm putting a couple grants to investigate the fungicides that will combat basically the fungus that exists here. Also testing rootstocks. There's a lot to be done with this, because the only literature out there is stuff from 40 years ago that occurred in Oklahoma at a nursery using fungicides that don't exist anymore. It's not really being investigated in other countries. If it is, it's more on a molecular level, but there's no really applied research out there that we can use. So what we're doing is gleaning from other systems. So this is where Carrick, I really want to pick his brain. Sure. Is from the peanut side of things and other hosts, because southern blight of peanuts very important. Yeah. And so, but the end goal is for my research, at least in the short term, like in the next year or two, is to understand rootstock susceptibility, to understand which fungicides work, fungicides that are labeled in other crops for southern blight that also have an apple label. That's apples also on the label, in order to get a 2EE labeling for these fungicides, so growers can use these fungicides in a preventative manner. So that's going to take some gathering of data to do. But yeah, so as far as the threat, South Central Pennsylvania is under threat. As far as the rest of the state, I don't know, because I haven't heard much. No one's told me anything. I've heard about instances in New Jersey, but they can have conditions like South Central Pennsylvania. Heard of an instance in Massachusetts. And one thing I want to get ahead of immediately is that this is not a nursery problem. And I say that pretty good confidence. And the reason why I say that with good confidence is that the nurseries would see this. They would be roguing trees because that sclerotia has to be sticking to mycelia on a very active infection on the tree. And they are not seeing that. The nurseries are not seeing that, which means it's coming from the site itself.
Mhm.
And so, but they are aware of this and they're being proactive to even address even the potential of this. But I do not think this is coming from the nurseries, because you would see it on the tree. There would be an active infection or the tree would be dying. The tree would be dead, be rogued out. And I've looked at a lot of trees. I've looked at the trees going in my own orchards and they're clean. They're absolutely clean going in. So I know nothing's lurking. It's coming from my site. It's definitely coming from my site. So.
Thank you so much for all that background. That's really thorough. And I know you've been kind of in the thick of it. So just really.
So yeah, I'll be interesting about
to share
the discussion about this because, especially because I know there was like the listserv, there was a lot of discussion online about the influence of climate change. The one thing that we need to be thinking about is not so much air temperature, but soil temperature. It's the soil temperature that we really need to be paying attention to, in addition to soil moisture, because that's what's so key with this disease is what's shifted, what's changed, where was the switch flipped. And not only that, but how can people be proactive in potentially anticipating it the further north you go? We have not had winter down here in Pennsylvania. Like the ground's not freezing. And so that most likely is influencing this.
So that's all very helpful. I'm wondering if, Carrie, you could add a little bit more context on sclerotium biology.
So I taught a lot of mycology. I did my PhD on, we'll call them endemic but invasive basidiomycete pathogens of stone fruit trees. In this case, it was armillaria. And what the growers were doing is they were clearing pine fields where armillaria was present and then planting on them. And the conditions became favorable for it to become a pathogen. And my colleague Guido has been working on this for years. They're struggling with the grapevines. The sclerotium pathogen is much nastier, if you will, in terms of much more an aggressive soil-borne basidiomycete pathogen. I've grown it. The pale sclerotia are immature. The dark ones are mature. And what it will do is when it's like, yep, run out of resources, I'm going to start making sclerotia. They can get in the soil. They can be buried, but I think there is a specific depth. I'd have to go look that up. But that's mostly for ornamentals. You're never going to bury it here. I'm friends with like Tony Kyneth, Hillary Mell, David Langston. So I've been looking over their papers. And it's kind of bleak for the most part. They used to fumigate, but as Carrie mentioned, it's off the table. And I was looking at that paper I posted in the chat from Peanuts, from Hillary and David's group. And the most terrifying aspect of it is that none of these sort of like low plant applied materials are getting anything at the crown. They're great on the leaves, but we want from Carrie's picture, it's there in bare soil, destroying the crown of a tree. It's kind of terrifying. Probably fumigation's off the table. Some fungicides are better than others. But then you're going to have to get 2 double E's off the materials that are labeled, which that will all fall on Carrie because she's got the stuff. It's easy to grow. The sclerotia can survive forever. I can keep it. I could still have a sclerotium from one of my Georgia cultures and grow it out today. And if you are going to bury them, you're going to need an organic soil to dissolve them. And that works really much better in ornamental systems. I was talking with Tony Kyneth, and he's coming out with a new paper about grafting, and this is in tomato, grafting onto other wild species. So I think Carrie's idea of looking at the rootstocks in the context of what's been developed in the last 20 years is probably a smart plan. I don't know what Carrie thinks. I'm gonna let her chime in on the Tyvek guard question, because I think it might actually be making it better. It wants hot, but it is gonna need that moisture and probably not much to grow. When I was in Georgia, I'd go out in the loading, I'd get in the truck, I'd kick over an ornamental planting, And once I moved the leaves back, it was just loaded with sclerotium. And I'm like, oh, that's your trunk guard. And so, yeah, those are sort of my experiences at the time being.
That's
Yeah,
great.
as far,
to add.
yeah.
Thank you. I think in more broadly, it would be helpful also to just know I'm coming to you from MOFGA here, so I'm always going to ask about non-chemical options as well. But I am curious if there are any, with the Tyvek coming up and rootstocks, are there other ideas that have come up for ways to manage?
The grafting seems to be what the tomato people are looking at, but it's questionable and not everyone's buying into it. Mulching is probably fine. Nitrogen might help, but it might make it worse. Yeah, that's going to be really tricky. It's an aggressive system, as Carrie mentions, and it wants your heat.
Mhm.
Organic
and-
growing is not the easiest.
Yeah, and you know, I've been talking to a couple companies about who specialize in alternative products, and it's more of like stuff's on my radar, just haven't tested it yet. And I do know that some growers who are super desperate, and I will say this is, yeah, Tyvek, maybe, but you don't need the Tyvek there for it to show up, because I've been in situations where there's no Tyvek there and the disease is doing just fine. So, I mean, you know, it might speed it along, but it's not, I don't think having the Tyvek tree guards is a, it's not something that's going to remove the tree guards and you're going to be just fine. If it's in the soil, it's going to do what it needs to do in the soil. But as far as, yeah, organic products, you know, I do know that some people, I know some consultants are going to be working with the growers to see about trying stuff, but you know, I've been still in the infancy stage. But I will say this is that in Pennsylvania, and this may not be as much of a problem in New York, but not all our growers have irrigation. So even like drip irrigation, even to be able to feed stuff through the irrigation line for fungicides to get where they need to go at the root zone, that's going to be another problem, another challenge to overcome. So, you know, as I'm thinking about application strategies, I have to be thinking about trunk sprays. Like, you know, we thought the trunk sprays were long gone with that, with basically Lorsban going by the wayside, but we might have to resurrect the trunk sprays for something like this, because that may be the only way to get fungicides and or anti-southern blight fungi measures directed to where they need to go. So, you know, that's another application strategy that's on my mind, because, and I will tell you this, is that I've seen orchards where there's 20,000 trees planted and there's no irrigation. And I've asked the growers, so what's the story with the irrigation? We don't have it. I'm like, well, so what, tell me the reason why. We've had basically, you know, people, professionals come here and we cannot get a well. We cannot get a well here. So, you know, and I don't know how many folks in New York are like that, but that's pretty common for us, where, you know, they're just relying on Mother Nature.
The other thing I was wondering about for just cultivation methods, you know, Carrie, you had said that Southern Blight is Southern Blight, but I'm curious, you know, knowing that there's such a revolution in mycology and being able to name things, like, do we feel confident that we still know that Southern Blight is always Southern Blight, or do we know that it's the same kind of variety and genotype that's attacking all these plants?
That needs to be investigated, but how it manifests in symptoms, it's textbook. But what I will say is that, I'm glad you brought that up. One thing that growers can be thinking of is that if they're going to be planting a new orchard, be mindful of what the cover crop is beforehand. I'm trying to get growers to not plant soybean or choose soybean, because soybean is a host. And so it's going to perpetuate or keep going whatever's there. Choose a non-host, because the idea is that when you choose a non-host like sorghum or wheat or corn, their root system could push any potential sclerotia further down into the soil. So you're burying the sclerotia and it's not going to be exposed at that root zone where apples are planted. So that's like the ideal scenario. So that's, you know, and especially talking with nurseries and folks that are who are planting apples regularly and do cover crops regularly, avoiding soybean. So that's a cultural method that could be utilized to help the situation. It's not going to cure it, but I think it's going to help potentially reduce the pathogen load.
It looks like the one you found was Delphinii. That's the hosta
Well,
one.
okay, I say that cautiously. We definitely need to be looking at more genes. That was just with the
Okay.
ITS. So
I mean, there seems to be very few that are involved, Carrie. So I would
Yeah,
feel
so
probably
that's-
comfortable. Maybe someone had a
Yeah.
diversified farm, because I've seen it on hosta a lot, and all you need to
Yeah.
do is like have my ornamentals over here, and the
and
next thing you
tomato,
know,
yeah.
yep,
The
yeah,
only thing is that is out of curiosity is that the strain of fungus that's here in Pennsylvania, is that similar or the same to what's occurring down south, or what was
Yeah.
found in Massachusetts, or what was found in New Jersey? That's like something that I'd like to pursue with either my lab or with someone else, to really understand, like, is this unique to us? Is it adapting? I mean, there's so many questions involved here. Yeah, that I'd be curious about investigating. But as far as the genus species, it's most likely it's the same southern blight pathogen. And going based on what Carrick just said. So
yeah. It's very interesting about the burial. Depending on the organism, you get different things. Deep burial for the bean, Sclerotinia sclerotiorm, is different, but it looks like some studies have shown a decline with deeper burial, up to 5 centimeters. So maybe you can mulch it, but I would pick a really heavy organic mulch. The other question, like, I agree. I think with her case, the trunk applications might be the only way to go. The other thing I kind of wonder is if anyone's ever gotten the feed grade urea from an apple scab degradation spray on yourself, you'll know that it burns. So I kind of wonder if that would work as well. We had to do a lot of survival studies with mummyberry, and caustic materials, even stuff like neem oil, reduced the viability of these things when they were exposed. But the thing is, by the time you see the sclerotium on the surface, it's killing your tree in that particular instance. And so I don't know. Yeah, I think it's going to get really tricky.
Carrie, do you feel like you've seen, now that you've seen this come through a few times, have you been able to notice symptoms before kind of you get the call if there's drastic dieback and you can see these mycelia already growing? Do you feel like there's a good sense of start looking earlier in the disease?
yeah, no, usually so the above ground parts, how it looks is that the tree looks off. Like, I know there's something going on at the crown, like the tree is yellowed or the tree doesn't look as green. And I'm like, there's something going on there. I have seen trees where it's been later in the season and it's like they're limping along, but death is right around the corner. And they didn't put out a lot of growth that year. And it was like an older tree. It wasn't a brand new tree. But usually it's like once you see the aerial symptoms, it's too late. And basically I will see, when I see the sclerotia on the soil or on the mycelia, the tree's already actively declining. So there is no warning sign. At least I haven't caught it soon enough. But I'm hoping to really dive into it this year, and maybe we will see early symptoms, but so far it's like I haven't been able to catch it soon enough. But when it has happened, when I've advised growers, I basically told them, I was like, okay, like there is no rhyme or reason in the field either. It's like it can occur very sporadically. And I'll tell growers, like, if you're removing the trees, you need to be really careful. Like, basically dig up the tree with a shovel, remove some of the soil around there so you're getting the sclerotia. Make sure you're not spreading that soil all over the place. Be very, very careful whether you're putting it in a barrel or a bag or whatever, as you're removing the trees, and I said, and be mindful of the trees nearby as far as keeping an eye on them.
I'm wondering if that sort of sudden aerial symptoms rings true for other plants that are affected by southern blight. Is that kind of what we see as a pattern in disease progression, that it's not a gradual progression, but pretty abrupt?
Yeah, Carrick, I'm not, yeah, I mean, like I said, I haven't been able to catch it soon enough.
I've never seen it, so because we live in New York, I still think we don't have the temperatures for it yet.
Yeah, I don't think you guys do either.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it's mainly, it does seem to be, I don't know, I've gotten so used to looking at trees and seeing subtle differences. And when you're used to seeing subtle differences, especially in the aerial parts, I can tell when something is off. But that's also comes from experience of looking at thousands and thousands of trees, and just kind of my eye is just trained to it. So that's taken practice, or I should say repetition over 10 years of looking at trees. So yeah, and I don't know about others, how other systems are.
So Carrie, in your case, have you seen this in a lot of, are all the farms just like, oh, I got 5,000 acres of apples and only apples, and where did this come from? Or are they more diversified?
So that's a good question. So I've talked to a grower recently, and who said, who basically was the grower where I first saw the Southern Blight. And I said, well, what's your situation now? He's like, every place I plant, I'm finding it. And he says, and I didn't get a chance to follow up on the conversation because this was at the Mid-Atlantic Fruit and Vegetable Convention. So we were like in between meetings, because I'm wondering where I planted my tomatoes last year, if that's influencing it, because and tomato is a host. And he says, this strip of trees, he says, we happened to plant it right in the same row where the tomatoes were. And he says, and that's where I'm seeing the trees decline. And so there is a situation where, yeah, especially this one grower, he's very diversified. I mean, they've got fruits and vegetables. They're dominant in the fruits department, but they are very mindful of where they're rotating their apples into. Usually they will, they may leave the ground in like some kind of cover crop, but then they'll go to some kind of veg, and then they'll do apple or peach. So, that's how they rotate their land. So yeah, in that case, I do think it is influencing the diversification. But where I originally saw it, they did not have veg in that area. It used to be woods many years ago. And I know this fungus can be very predominant in forests in the soil. And so it may have been just lying in wait, and it was virgin soil to orchards. They had was in grass for a long time, and then they planted it, and that's when basically the disease took over. But now I think because of the conditions over the last many years, there are other crops that are susceptible are getting it. So it's been an unfortunate science experiment for them. But I will say that the grower that has like 20,000 trees in this one location that can't get water, it was apple before. It was big apple trees that were on a big semi-dwarf rootstock. So I have not seen this yet in older semi-dwarfs. So it may have been one of these situations where the disease might have been in the soil, but the big old trees might have been able to withstand it. And it's that, that situation where once you remove it and they let the ground stay fallow for a while, or they had it cover cropped into something else before they planted their 20,000 trees, their high density system. But these locations where they were always apple, unless it was right before they had done something else. So I think it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag of stuff. And I will say at our Freck research station, we've never had vegetables at our location. It's been grass in some parts. And where I've got orchards, they're dropping like flies to Southern Blight. And it's just been grass there at least for 20 years. And so it had been orchard maybe 40 years ago, but it was big semi-dwarf trees that were in that location. But at least during my time before I planted, it had been in grass for 10 or more years. Lawn, turf grass.
Well, it sounds like you're struggling with the similar problem as the peach industry did, where you're clearing out stuff and, oh, there it is. Glenn's got a question down there about how do they deal with it in Virginia and Maryland? I mean, I know Sarah sees it sporadically, but not that often. Any thoughts on the other states, Carrie?
I don't, and I haven't heard anything. I mean, no
Nope.
one's come forward. And in Maryland, I don't know. Yeah. And I know Glenn had a question about what fungicides are used in other crops. So I should have printed out my grant because I do have a list of fungicides.
Mhm.
I do know that the product Fontellus, so the penthiopyrad, I know is good. The strobilurins, I guess, are good.
Yep.
Trifloxystrobin, I think. So that's Flynn Extra, what's in Luna
Yep.
Sensation. The Frac 7s in general, I guess, seem to be good, the SDHIs. The one product that I know off the top of my head that definitely has a Southern Blight label for tomato and carrot is Omega. So Omega can be used as a soil drench for those crops. It's labeled in apple, but just as an area spray. So, you know, these are some of the fungicides that we're going to try to see, you know, how they'll work. But it has me so concerned that in South Central Pennsylvania, it's a bigger disease than fire blight, believe it or not, because of the lack of control measures, the preventative control measures. And it has me that worried. And it's just getting worse and for growers.
So Carrie and Carrick, this is Dave Rosenberger. You probably know from previous correspondence, I'm not a climate change denier, but I have trouble believing that this is suddenly showing up just because of warmer soils. I'm more inclined to think about what else has changed. And two things that have changed over my career are much narrower tree canopies and much better herbicide. And I think both of those would contribute to hotter soils, the bare ground being exposed on the sides of the tree rows. And I doubt that there's any way to document that, but almost certainly the soil in these two-dimensional plantings is getting hotter because the herbicided soil is exposed to direct sunlight much more of the time. The other factor is trickle irrigation. And Carrie, you mentioned that you started seeing the outbreak in a year with excessive rainfall, but I'm wondering whether we're saturating soils too long with trickle right by the tree row, and whether the saturated soils next to the trees may be allowing this pathogen that was perhaps present forever, but now with warmer soils and trickle, maybe not always in combination. But then the third factor, and I haven't been able to find anything, I haven't looked in detail, but how does plant stress relate to susceptibility? And are trees that are planted 2 feet apart or whatever, the various stress conditions making trees more susceptible? That would also play into the rootstock role and everything else. And so I guess my question is, I'm really curious about underlying changes that may have contributed, in addition to climate change, contributed to the emergence of this further north.
Well, so to kind of go through your questions in order, you mentioned about the herbicide rows and potentially the soil getting hotter. One of the control measures that basically for Southern blight is to keep weeds and debris away from the tree. So it's like that's actually encouraged. It's like a double-edged sword, basically what you're saying as far as the soil potentially warming up, but at the same time, excessive debris encourages this pathogen to take off. The orchard where I first found this it was completely herbicided. There was no weeds in these tree rows. Also, the trees weren't 2 feet apart either. Also, as far as the tree stress, I think that's interesting. Someone just brought me lunch, so I was just giving them a thumbs up. What's interesting, I've had trees that were 11 years old that were perfectly fine collapse. I've seen trees that were 5 or 6 years old. So maybe tree stress, but I think it's more of the tree was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the fact that if trees are rootstocks are susceptible, I don't think it matters whether or not if they're susceptible, the fungus is there, they're going to get the disease. Your comment about trickle irrigation, I mentioned about growers where I'm seeing it run rampant. There's no trickle irrigation there. So we can't blame it on trickle irrigation for locations where there's no trickle irrigation or any irrigation. It could be a combination of things, but I think it's all valid points, but it's not solving the problem. You know, I think it was, I'm wondering, had we not had 2018 and we didn't have 40 extra inches of rain in the second half of 2018, and it also wasn't hot, we may have not seen this and may have stayed dormant. I think it's always been lurking. It may have always been lurking there, but because of that 1 year, that was the domino that set things off. And, you know, it's like a runaway train. We haven't been able to catch that runaway train. And, it may have happened sporadically before that, but no one ever saw it. But for us, 2018 was basically what set everything into motion.
Hey, Carrie, quick question. When you had, so the 2018 summer was rainy, right? What was the winter going into 2019, right? It makes me wonder if it made a whole bunch of mycelium. Oh, it was still warm?
It was still wet. I have to look at the temperatures, but it was still really wet.
Okay, but
like,
I wonder.
I remember, because I did a meeting, I was doing winter meetings, and I took pictures of still standing water in orchards.
Okay.
So it persisted and it still was wet. And then I do remember, I think it was in 2020, like that's the other thing, there was talk, and I think I may have seen this on the listserv, as far as we don't have to worry about southern blight in the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast because the pathogen won't overwinter. Well, we've had several winters where the ground's not really freezing. And so then the question is that lack of the ground not freezing or the ground staying warm in the warmer during the winter, is that influencing it? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I will say that I think it was in 2020, I remember seeing dandelions blooming at Freck in the ground at the end of January. Yeah. So
I kind of like your entrenchment theory. A lot of times when I used to work with Mommy Berry, you'd see a person who didn't have it, and then the next year, after a bad year, they had it so entrenched because of the sclerotia, they could never get rid of it. And it went from like, oh, that's a weird looking strike, to the next year being an impossibility without moving the entire sod in the orchard. So I'm kind of wondering if that's what eventually happened with your 2018 huge trigger, and just allowed it so much inoculum to get in there and be impossible to remove, since it's a perennial crop.
And
that
let that be a
with
lesson, also to other folks too, with potentially similar conditions in the future, if that would ever happen, use the Adams County 2018 scenario as a cautionary tale. Jeremy mentioned about steaming the soil. That is something that I've been thinking about too, as far as steaming the soil. And I think that would work, but it would have to be on a very small basis. And I know a nurseryman who has like an orchard who is going to try that on a small scale, because there's like this section of orchard that is affected by southern blight because of the way the water drains in this one orchard. And so that's persistently wet, and this is where southern blight is showing up. And he's working with a company to try out this soil, either steaming and or soil solarization, somehow cooking the soil in the orchard. So
yeah, the steam stuff is good, but I know a lot from the California strawberry industry that they spend a lot of money on fuel. That's where the trick with steam comes in. Yeah. But it might be, if it's your only option. It's your only option.
So the question about biofumigation, I'd try anything. I mean, mustard, especially mustard, seems to have properties that can both suppress nematodes or kill nematodes and plant pathogens. So maybe, it would have to be tested, so, I mean, I'm open to anything. I mean, desperate times call for desperate measures. So, I'd be willing to try anything.
I can say,
I will say that we've done biofumigation sites with sorghum and with rapeseed at Freck. So it'll be interesting to see how those locations fare where we did 2 years of biofumigation. you know, with rapeseed and sorghum Sudan grass. So.
Gary, you mentioned you have it at Freck. What percentage of trees are affected in your planting or in other typical plantings? Is it 10% or where it occurs? Is it, 10% or 50%? What kind of incidents are you really looking at?
That's a good question. It's variable. It's really variable. So, and it's variable by site. I would say the first location I investigated, it was probably 20%. And then I had 2 locations at Freck. It was like barely 1% because it was just like a tree, 1 tree here, 1 tree there. The grower where he's got like 20,000 trees, oof. Let me think. That's at least, let me think how many. That's at least 10% of his orchard, at least 10, if not more, that I'm aware of. Let's put it that way, as far as how much he's replaced. Because I think in the last 2 years, he's replaced at least 1,000 trees. And then in other locations, I'm not sure. I haven't visited them yet. I've only heard about them, so I'm not quite sure. It really varies. It varies by location.
And from what you're saying, it's usually very scattered, not 15 trees in a row. It's more or less a few trees here, a few there.
Yeah.
Concerning your comments about the 2018 outbreak, I believe it was 1982. We had a huge outbreak in the Hudson Valley of Phytophthora root rot, something that no grower had seen before or has seen since. And in that situation, we had a very dry spring going into June and then excessively wet year. And trees, even newly planted trees on MM111 were coming down with Phytophthora, and one grower had trees on MM104, which is an unusual rootstock that was abandoned soon after it was released because of super susceptibility to Phytophthora. However, this grower had trees that were somewhere between 15 and 25 years old, and they succumbed that year. So there was something very unusual. Wilcox and people in his lab later showed that you get massive release of zoospores under flooded conditions following a drought. So I think the trees were stressed, the zoospores had a massive release, and the trees were just at the point where they were starting to form fruitlets. So a lot of demand without a lot of a leaf area yet. My point was that with that disease, it was a 1-year phenomenon. It's never reoccurred, but Phytophthora doesn't have the long-term resting stage that you have with southern blight. And so I think your scenario makes a lot of sense, that you had a unique situation that build up, and then you have this residual of resting spores that can last a long time thereafter. But you mentioned we, in other areas, could sort of take warning, and I guess without a labeled fungicide, I'm not sure there's anything we could do, or is there?
Well, since I'm basically the guinea pig here, one of the things that I would love to figure out or love to develop is a soil test. Is to be, and I know that this article that I read from 40 years ago where they were able to test the soil for sclerotia. So it'd be a matter of trying to devise either some kind of molecular test to be able to like grind up the DNA in the soil and try to test for this. I mean, that's kind of pie in the sky, what I think would be great. So, then, we could figure out everything in order to help you guys. So I don't know, Carrick, I should say, is there anything, anything in peanut or the ornamentals that you're aware of that
detecting for it?
As far as testing ahead of time?
I mean, you can, but it's going to have the same caveats as all the other stuff like nematodes, where you'll sieve them out. I think people have done PCR type tests and stuff as well, but it's going to be like everything else where you need 8 million soil samples, and then how much variability depending on how many samples you can take. Unless you're seeing it, then if you see it, then you don't need to test for it. Yeah, I don't know. I think it'll be tricky, just like testing with any soil-borne disease, and I think it'll be a sampling problem.
And I'm
Um,
wondering too, knowing for some environmental similar testing, like how do we know if it's viable or present? With sclerotia, they're so protected, they might not be viable anymore, but you might still be getting DNA off of it.
That's the other concern, yeah.
Um,
But it would make you scared if you got a positive hit for the pathogen. Yeah, in that case, you'd be like, uh-oh, we better be doubling up. And, maybe doing some of the things that Dave mentioned changed, or being mindful of those can't hurt the situation,
Mhm.
I was wondering, there was a question about what might feed on sclerotia, and you had said trichoderma does. Do we feel like that's a potential avenue that could be explored later? Has that been used as a biofungicide in other southern blight?
So I will tell you, I don't think so, because I pull out a lot of trichoderma from these samples. When we're isolating the southern blight, we pull out a ton of trichoderma. It's there just fine. It's not doing anything. Yeah. Or it's overwhelmed. That could be also another thing, is that the pathogen is just so aggressive that the trichoderma is overwhelmed. So unless you were able to develop a trichoderma that was equally as aggressive, that may be the only way. But what's existing in the soil now is not helping anything.
Yeah, it can run your cultures, but I'll agree with Carrie. It's none of the articles that I'm reading about new technologies for management say, forget our stuff, just use trichoderma. No, they don't even include it as sort of a thing that could work, but hasn't yet. So, I mean, that's sort of off their radar. It seems that in the other systems as well. Yeah.
With the many pathogens, the amount of disease is related to the dose. In other words, a single spore in some cases will not be sufficient to cause disease. I think apple scab may be different, and I'm wondering whether there's evidence on apples or any other crop in terms of the increasing disease with increasing number of sclerotia, or is a single sclerotium enough to trigger disease in most cases?
I think it's going to be a matter of potential, like with the mummyberry. I think maybe in year one it's not, but if it goes unnoticed, like Carrie was concerned about, I think things can snowball quickly if you have a 2018. I think that's generally the case, and you're right. I think for the most part, if I went out with a single sclerotium, like let's kill some trees, I don't think it would work. I agree. You're going to have that inoculum potential, and what that is for apple, I don't know, but I think it could be like, maybe I grow a little bit and then I make 50 sclerotia that we have for next year. And then they get washed down in the flood of 2018 to all the way down the row. And then, I think it can snowball, but you're right. I think if you have a low level, it's probably not going to get you with just one. Not like a fire blight bacterium, which will get into flower and then explode later. I think you're 100% right. It's going to be a matter of inoculum potential.
There's a system in soybeans where they go through and run the stuff through soil sieves and count the sclerotia and use a threshold. So I suspect that we'd see a similar thing with apples.
Glad you could join us, Dan. Everyone had questions about your first discovery.
I'm sorry I'm late. It just seems to be happening lately that I have to put extension-y and researchy things down lower on my list and do more administrative-y things.
So Glenn's asked a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to turn our attention to. The first is, how many sites are affected in Pennsylvania, and are there any commonalities that you're seeing between affected and unaffected sites?
That's what I'm going to try to investigate this year, because I've got hopefully one bigger grant and then one smaller grant to work on this summer. I have read that low pH can be favorable for the pathogens. So that's one thing I'm curious about, is like testing the pH of the soil around those affected trees. When I've talked to a consultant for one of the growers who's greatly affected, I looked at the soil sample and it was normal. Like it was pH 6.5 for the soil, which is normal. But that was probably a composite. I'm more curious about like, well, let's look at the individual locations where we're seeing southern blight versus where we're not seeing southern blight in that one orchard. As far as number of sites, let me think. I know it's a half a dozen so far in Adams County, at least that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's more, but that's just the few that I've heard of. And there's at least there's 4 sites just at Freck in different locations on our farm where we're seeing it pop up. So yeah, so I think that was the question. I think I got the most of that question answered.
Yeah, so the next question that he'd asked is how likely is it that trunk sprays that you'd mentioned would provide enough protection to let a tree outgrow southern blight?
Well, I'm not sure it's more of outgrow as preventing. I'm not sure a tree can outgrow it. And that's something that we're going to have to test, you know, because it's never been tested. So the fact that there are no viable fungicides or tests or, you know, to try to combat this or to study it, we're going to be working from the ground up for this. So hopefully in a year, Glenn, we'll have that answer for you. You know, maybe we'll try testing various degrees of infection to see if we're able to stop something in its tracks. But I have a feeling once the train leaves the station, we're not going to be able to pull it back in. It's going to have to be done on a preventative measure. So what I'm envisioning as how this will go down is that, okay, we go and visit Orchard A. Orchard A has an active case of southern blight. What I would recommend to the grower is you're going to have to dig up each of the affected trees carefully, dig up the soil within that hole, bag it or put it in a bucket or whatever. And in the surrounding trees that are unaffected and not showing symptoms, you're going to have to do trunk sprays. That's the way I'm envisioning this, is that they're going to have to rogue the affected trees and then treat the asymptomatic trees. I don't know if Carrick has anything.
No, I would say that sounds like the best plan. When I read this
that's
literature,
basically how I'm envisioning it.
Yeah, I agree with Carrie. I think that might be what you have to do. When I read the literature, it's like, well, we did the sprays, and that's just so that we can get as much yield out of the plot before it all dies. That's, you know, in that case, they're not even trying to save individual plants. They're just trying to keep that yield up and slow it down from killing. And so I think Carrie's right. Like, just like in that case of the bad mummyberry, the grower had to remove all of his sod, and then his fungicide sprays were able to like get him back on track. And I think that's what's going to happen here. You'll have to rogue them and you'll have to dig them up like with a backhoe, like they do in Georgia for malaria or something, and take as much of the roots as you can. As scary as that is.
You think that the sclerotia are produced in early stages or only after the tree is mostly dead? And the point in asking that is, would growers be better advised to pull out a weak tree rather than waiting until it's dead?
So that first year when I was digging up the trees or digging through the soil of trees that were actively dying, they weren't quite dead yet. And I don't know, maybe Carrick has more insight this, but when I saw the mycelia through the soil, I saw swellings on that mycelia, which I suspect were basically that's the early stage of the sclerotia.
Yeah.
And so at that stage, I mean, the tree was actively dying, but it wasn't quite dead yet. So, you know, we caught it that early, or I should say we caught it at that stage, and it was pretty consistent through the block. The dead trees, I don't remember. I just remember trees, yellow leaves up top.
Yeah, it seems that any portion of a mycelium that's not getting a lot of food will go ahead and start making sclerotia, even if other portions are killing the tree. So yeah, the moment you see it, you don't even want to wait for the tree to even die. I would say you do Carrie's plan.
Yeah.
So we're running close to the end here. I think I just wanted to wrap up by saying that we've talked a lot around this, but given all of the little details that we've discussed today, I'm wondering what both of you think about what states need to worry, where people need to be worried, and what would productive worry look like from this crowd?
Well, if there's Marylanders on here, you're in the same boat. You're the area where you grow your fruit trees are right where Adams County is, as far as, I mean, like you remove the state borders or state border, and basically that's where our tree fruit growing area is. So I'd say for the Marylanders, you're under threat just like us, because you are in the same conditions. New Jersey being a bit warmer, typically, I think there's a potential there. The further north, Carrick might have better
I don't know,
insight.
Dave.
I
What do
mean,
you think about the Hudson Valley? Do you think there's a
there,
concern?
yeah, the Hudson Valley.
My understanding is that soil drainage has a lot to do with it as well. So New Jersey with more sand may be at less risk than some of
Okay.
our areas with heavier soils. And I think growers who have planted on sites that are not well drained or swales that have heavy soil is where I would expect it to show up the soonest. I also wondered whether, relating to my question about soil temperature, the slope of the land, if the land is sloped toward the west or southwest, I'm thinking that provides a more direct exposure of the herbicide strip. And again, I would expect warmer soil temperatures. So there may still be some relationships there between what's happening underground and the soil exposure, and just a whole lot of interactions. The fact that individual trees are dying tells me there's something unique about either the tree or the microenvironment. Otherwise, it would be every tree down the row. So when it's an individual tree, there's some
But it
unknown
also,
reason. Yeah,
it could be like nematodes where you have
exactly.
hotspot. You know, I will say, yeah, your comment about the west facing slope, that's an interesting comment. But again, this one grower who doesn't have the irrigation, where it is on a sloping area, but it's facing the east. So it's so you know, sort of, you know, not to poke holes in the theory, but it is a very exposure facing. But again, that's all very interesting observations and comments, and a lot to think about. You know, it's like, really, how would the soil heat up? What are ways the soil can heat up? And the way you described it is very, I mean, that's a really valid way, you know.
And it may be that the soil is less exposed to sun, dry more slowly as well. So you have the interaction between soil moisture retention and subsoil drainage. I mean, it's just very complex. I don't expect anybody to have the answers, but I'm hoping as people make observations, they'll sort of keep some of those factors in mind to see if there's, over time, any patterns that can be elucidated that would help explain why specific blocks or trees are affected.
Oh, yeah, those are some good points. I wanted to add with like the mummyberry pathogen, it depends on chill hours. But if you don't get a lot, you can get a very long period of degree days. And it could be something like, you know, Roseberg's, if you don't have enough moisture, you're going to need more heat. You don't have enough heat, maybe you'll need more moisture. And then it would explain weird things like why Washington State still has fire blight, even though they have no moisture. So it could be a spectrum relationship where it's a little bit of give and take, which would allow situations like Dave's to occur, and as well as the observations Carrie's seeing.
And I'm glad you brought up New Jersey and sandy soil, because I will say Pennsylvania and Adams County, we have the Arntsville gravelly loam. So we kind of have like a nice blend in our soil, but you know, there's clay in there. So I think being mindful of what your soil content is and how well it drains, I think that's a really good point Dave brought up. And I also will add by saying bud 9, super susceptible. Bud 9 is not resistant. Because the majority of the trees that I've encountered so far, majority are bud 9. So that will be my last parting words about southern blight, is bud 9 is susceptible.
Well, we are just at 1 o'clock. So We're going to wrap up now, but thank you both so much for all of your help and wisdom there. Hopefully we'll know a little bit more the next time we have a stupid question sessions on Southern Blight. We'll see how it goes. We are going to be posting these videos publicly. This was recorded and it will be in the future. They have not, last week's has not yet been posted, but when those do go up publicly, we'll make sure to send those links out through the listserv. Thanks,
So
everyone.
join us for the next one is going to be exactly 1 month on March 15th. We're taking a few weeks off. March 15th we'll have Carrick back again. We'll be talking about strep resistant fire.
Oh no.
So
All right.
hope to see you all there.
Cool.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.